I am back to cautiously optimistic. After last year's budget of destitute and forlorn and, on a desert island, I'm back to cautiously optimistic Ben Bergen.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the BetaKit Podcast. I am Douglas Saltis, Editor-in-Chief of BetaKit, coming to you live from cloudy Ottawa for another budget reaction podcast, the Canada Strong 2025 edition. And this budget, much like the State of the Nation, is filled with uncertainty. $1 trillion in committed investments. I think $78 billion in deficits for this and next year. And a bunch of really interesting commitments to and for Canadian tech. But is it going to help build Canada strong? I have no idea. I just have this book. So help me answer these questions. Are three of my favorite policy wonks together all at once to Voltron this podcast together. We got Vass Bednar. She's the managing director of the Canadian Shield Institute. We've got Jaxson Khan, who's the founder and CEO of Aperture AI, Monk School Senior Fellow, and the former Senior Policy Advisor for ISED. That might come into play in this conversation. And then longtime podcast listeners will recognize the handsome and charming face of one Ben Bergen, President of the Council of Canadian Innovators. Okay, guys, I want to start this. Oh, yeah, say hi. Everyone say hi.
Hi.
Hi, Douglas.
The podcast will continue until morale improves. I have so many questions to ask you, and I know we're short on time, and I know we're also recording from unique environments and quite tired. I was late last night after running into him in the cafeteria earlier in the day of the budget lockup, watching Peter Armstrong on CBC trying to contextualize this budget. And he said that every budget is an output of storytelling. It's trying to tell the story of a nation or of a year or of a government. And I thought, God damn it, Peter, that's really strong. He was not available for this podcast, but I'm going to steal his idea and ask you guys the question. And maybe we'll go around in what for me is counterclockwise order. I want to start before we get into the numbers and the commitments and all those other things that we love to do in this podcast. Is like, what story is this budget telling to you? And I'm going to start with Vass just because I'm contractually obligated to do so.
You know, I think there's a story here. This is a central banker's budget, right? This is a recalibration for Canada. And to me, this is very much authored by somebody who is a little bit offline too, right? Because the story that we're telling of Canada through this budget treats the internet and the digital economy as a little bit of an afterthought, right? In terms of the realities of how all of us experience everyday lives, like through our phones, right? That's not quite reflected in terms of what we're saying Canada needs to do and what Canada needs to take on. So that invisibility of the intangible economy, I think, persists. And I only say that to you out the gate, Douglas, because this has characterized my entire policy career. Right? When I was in grad school studying at the Monk School, 2008, 2009, 2010, the way we were talking about Canada kind of in the classroom and in newspapers was not how my friends and I were interacting with Canada. So I think there's always an opportunity for us to be thinking about the technologies of today and tomorrow. And there's glimmers of that here, which is really, really interesting too. Okay. I fear that was too long an answer, but you know, no. we're getting there. We're close, but it feels maybe like a bit of, maybe it's just a generational gap a little bit in terms of how who's experiencing, like what Canada are we experiencing through this budget?
I think that's a great primer. I love that you brought into the question of like, what is the internet? We'll probably get into that. And even on...
You've heard of it, right?
Yes, familiar.
Okay.
You did two other interesting things. You kind of at least alluded to the specter of competition a little bit and your focus, which I see some angles in that we'll get into and
for sure
particular verticals that I'm quite happy to see finally moving on. But then also you said intangible economy, which means that you got to that before Ben did.
What's the prize?
Huge. The prize is that Ben gets to go next because we took a talking point he's used several times on this podcast, and I'm wondering, Ben, I don't necessarily need to hear if you agree with Vass's conception of this. I want you to tell a counter story, a counter narrative, if you have one.
Yeah. So look, the fact that Vass mentioned the intangible economy means I'm already winning. Because I have been beating it drum for the last 10 years. And the fact that other people are raising it on said podcast before me, huge win. So to be honest, I feel like most of my work is done here. I'm going to take the rest of the day off. But no, look, this budget...
What a victory lap.
Ultimately was an investment budget and really trying to signal to the markets that this is a country to invest in. I'm a Control F person. Control F the word investment. It shows up almost 800 times in this budget.
Yes.
Control F the word productivity. It shows up 125 times in this budget. Buy Canadian shows up over 21 times in this budget. And so what this budget is ultimately trying to signal is that this is a country to invest in. And what we see in the numbers is ultimately inputs, right? Is a lot of, in dual purpose defense, a lot in other areas. The question then becomes, are we going to get a return on those as investments? And I think that's for me where this conversation is going to go is we've put in place, dollar amounts for, cybersecurity, for dual purpose defense technologies, for digital, modernization of our procurement systems and of our government. But at the end of the day, are you able to turn $1 into 10? And that's where I think the big piece of the conversation I want to have is currently laying.
Okay. That's the closest thing I've ever heard Benjamin Bergen take to a victory lap ever before. Who would have thought?
The man deserves a victory lap.
Doug, I am back to cautiously optimistic. After last year's budget of destitute and forlorn and, on a desert island, I'm back to cautiously optimistic Ben Bergen. So that's pretty exciting.
That is
update your name in Riverside.
It's already on the poly markets. The Bergen index up to cautious. And for people who remember that we truly did, this was a planned thing. This was a plant. These policy wonks giving us some time the day after the budget to speak to their thoughts on it. Last year was a true emergency podcast because what everyone was expecting or not expecting or hoping for was completely overshadowed by this capital gains tax exception that seemed to come out of nowhere. And in rage, basically BetaKit's audience and the people that we cover, Jaxson, coming in here for again, you don't need to counter what's been presented. I want you to present your own story and narrative that you see in this budget. But first, I want you to tell our audience if you had more fun during this budget or more fun during last year's budget.
Well, I definitely had more fun in this year's budget because I wasn't receiving calls from Ben and others about leaving everyone destitute. But full disclosure before I kick in, my current boss is the current finance minister, which I know is a reality that Ben has also been in. I'm also very grateful to Ben and Vass and the folks at both CCI and Shield for shedding light on a lot of critical issues. I would actually just say the biggest takeaway I think for innovators in Canada should be on the language and the prioritization of innovation and growth. That is it literally let's just look. It's a first section in the budget. It's how do we grow the economy? I think this without being too biased, I think it makes Canada look quite good. It's okay, lowest relative debts in the G7, lots of room to invest. And it's basically saying two top takeaways, let's cut the size of government and the public service and let's go and invest more in the economy. That's a really good thing, especially with what's going on right now. And Canada's, facing kind of unprecedented trade wins and lots of turnover. So I think overall really good. I think what I'm, trying to dig into is for this government, they're trying to invest in productivity boosts. That's good. They're also trying to maintain kind of this, this baseline social safety net agreement we've kind of come to in Canada, which is, around pharmacare, increasingly on housing. How do we make sure that everyone has what they need to live? And so I think that's what the government's trying to balance right now. I think for innovators too, like the biggest tax on innovation has been the cost of housing. The fact that we've had excess immigration that's overwhelmed our social system and our supports, and the fact that there's some steps to address that here, I think is a good thing. I think if I compare this year to last year's budget, I would also say, to agree with Ben, I'm cautiously optimistic. I think there's a few things that I would definitely want to see some more detail on the implementation side that's relevant for the innovators, but I know we'll get into all that. And I'll just say, like, if they get it right, as Vass said, this is a central banker's directed budget, and also a finance minister who comes very much from the business community. Like, this could totally reshape the nature of our financial system, where the biggest problem we've often heard from innovators is that we have a capital problem in this country. And so if capital is becoming more easily available, if financial services are provided in a much better way, more competitive economy, like those are all good directionality things to have. So that's my read.
I appreciate you also speaking to other components of the budget and the state of Canada that aren't related to tech. That's why you're a good person, Jaxson. But being a control F guy like Ben, Jaxson, is that idea of like the language metadata as an indication of intention or emphasis hold true? Like, how much is that relevant when you see, like, you control F innovation or investment, and you see that all over the place? Is that like a rhetorical consistency? Is that reflected in the policy or the financial commitments? Do you have anything you can speak to in your prior career that could shed light on that?
Yeah, like here's a quick good example. Like if you control F on AI, it's everywhere, right? And if I would like just view in isolation the AI industrial policy promise in this budget, it's actually not very large, right? So like, what did they say? Okay, we're going to use 800 million of money that was already promised before, add 125, and that's kind of our sovereign infrastructure piece to start off with. The second thing is we're going to unlock some funding from the Canadian Infrastructure Bank. Could be promising. And there's a couple other things, and then the quantum piece roughly doubles what we've had on the table, but given the scope of what is probably in front of us, maybe not enough. But just to dial in on AI for a second, I'm less convinced by what's immediately in front of the AI kind of industrial strategy, but more about, okay, clearly this government thinks AI is very important because they're trying to embed it across the system. They're trying to embed it into every major consideration. It's going to be part of shred claims, right? It's going to be part of immigration evaluation. It's going to be a part of how do we get more people inside the public service who actually understand this technology. It's empowering an Office of Digital Transformation. Like, it's just layered in multiple components. And so given that the AI task force is just going through its work, I would expect there's more to see on AI. And that's on the industrial policy side and the regulatory side. But what I'm more compelled by from just a policy perspective is, okay, clearly this government thinks that AI is just a part of everything. And I think that's great news for innovators. Because if that's coupled with a good Buy Canadian policy, then, as Ben particularly advocates for many members, like that's a good shot for them to embed across the public service and different streams there. Yeah.
Vass, I'm going to give you an opportunity there. Like, is there anything, because you had an analyst in lockup, anything that you're sending them to search for or look for, keep an eye on?
I'm a control F girly too. It was interesting to kind of compare and contrast our wordles. I mean, on the AI element, adoption done right can be great, right? Canada abandoned the Efficiency Defense in our Competition Act a few years ago, but we haven't replaced it with anything in terms of articulating, like, what do we value over anything else when we're building the economy, right? And we're still sort of saying, efficiency is still a holy grail for Canada, right? We want to make firms more efficient. We think they're going to become more efficient if they use AI, therefore they should use AI. So something I'm reflecting on as I kind of digest and ingest the budget is when we also have applications of algorithmic systems that are challenging for consumers and businesses, how alive can we be to that, right? And back to sort of reducing frictions and this work around one Canadian economy that we do want to build and be really strong. That work on the interprovincial trade barrier frictions is just the beginning. It's got to be a baseline for Canada. It's also something we've been doing for quite some time. If you thought the boundaries between provinces were bad, you should talk to independent businesses and sellers about a broken ad tech stack, about what it takes, when 45 cents of every dollar you sell on Amazon goes into the pocket of Amazon. That's part of why our firms aren't as competitive and aren't as productive, because of the gatekeeping, the tolls and taxes, and frankly, like all those digital trade barriers that they're up against. So that's why I kind of always want to bring that lens and kind of straddle, that analog world that's more familiar. And I know I'm saying sort of Ben's magic bingo word, and I'll give him another point on the board with intangibles. But that's the thing about the intangible economy, right? It's harder to see. And technology does not have a riding in the way that most other sectors in Canada have this like very rich or at times concentrated economic geography. And that means that we sometimes lose the constituency of those voices and those considerations. You could argue, Waterloo, we could sort of pick a couple of places, but politically, I think when you look at like a cabinet or a voting map, it's hard to, you're not like, well, that area, those are the people that are highly concentrated in one geographic area who really care about capturing value from research and from R&D at their businesses and from doing new things. So again, I say it not as a criticism, but as like almost this perpetual blind spot where I think I'm good at nudging to sort of spotlighting how we can do better, right? That we can still capture that.
It's really important. I'm glad that you're bringing it up. I am interested in the take on whether or not this constituency is geographically or not represented, because I know like through Jackson's previous work and Benjamin's current work, whether or not it's a geographical body, there is some industry pipelines where I don't see representation is the demographic of people impacted by those tech considerations, if not part of the tech constituency, because it's across socioeconomic and situations like that. We'll get to some of that when I want to talk about competition in certain spheres. Sure. But I want to go back, Vass, in terms of that intangible consideration. Again, educate me on this, your expectation. Do you expect those types of commitments or language that in a budget, whether or not it's a central banker's budget? Because my expectation is usually it's, here are the dollars that we're spending. Like defense is a great example. There's going to be a defense industrial strategy. This budget tells you nothing about it, but we can tell you all the things that we've earmarked, because at the end of the day, this is a financial document or presentation. Yeah. And then any kind of policy or legislative change is noted in the enactment of certain considerations, whether it's like new departments or things like that. They're not necessarily talking about policy for the sake of policy. It's like, hey, we're going to have new open banking legislation to enact phase 2, or we're going to set up this department to do this. So are you disappointed that stuff isn't addressed in this budget, or should we be expecting that stuff to be addressed in a budget?
There's a nugget, right, in the kind of 3-quarter paragraph around intellectual property that we're going to be doing a review of kind of the intellectual property programs that we have in Canada. I might venture, and, Jaxson knows more about this. Ben, you hear and think about this all the time, that it's well understood how kind of fragmented those programs are and kind of how we can benchmark against other jurisdictions. I bring it up because this budget, if I had to tell a different story, I would say we're trying to figure out how to do more, not with less, but with what we have, right? Part of building Canada strong is like maximizing Canada. And that means not leaving value on the table. That means when we invest in knowledge institutions and incredible R&D, that the patents don't go elsewhere or kind of get sold, right? It also means with our critical mineral and kind of our natural resources that we're starting to try to resist that impulse to kind of rip and ship, and that maybe we're willing to be a bit more patient and do more of that value-added processing here. I know there's a parliamentary committee, the Science and Research Committee is looking at R&D investments, and that we're always kind of alive to intellectual property opportunities for Canada. It's a real whodunit, right? That we underinvest in R&D. But I think Ben has put forward at that committee, you were there last week, Ben, other ideas. Again, putting other ideas in the window for Canada to consider. But you asked me, should we have things like this in a budget? Yeah, because what kind of country do we want to be? We want to do amazing things. Why do we want to do amazing things? We're not just showing off because we want to create and capture and maximize economic value from the wonderful things that institutions and businesses are doing here.
Okay. There were certainly a lot of tasty nuggets in this budget that are lacking in detail. And I know a couple of you addressed questions that we have going forward in terms of execution implementation. Again, this is a new Liberal government, but it's also still the Liberal government that had earned a reputation for not being able to execute on past commitments. I want to save that for the second section when we go through and asking you guys like where your big question or like the nug that you wish has some dipping sauce of execution with it. But I want to share one more narrative. And again, I had a particularly interesting experience of sitting directly behind Paul Wells as he was working through the budget yesterday. I saw him only working with pen and paper, and yet somehow right at 4:00 when the embargo was up, he had 2 stories filed that were emailed to me because I've subscribed to his Substack. And this is the narrative that he laid out. And I want to just make sure that as we all come with our pet things that we care about, we don't skip past the current Canadian circumstance. So I'm just going to read this verbatim for Paul Wells. Under current economic challenges, the budget points out that the cost of living is high, unemployment is up, business uncertainty is delaying investment, global economic growth is slowed, which means there's more limited room for Canada to borrow growth from its non-US trading partners. Productivity is weak, and oil, traditionally the rabbit tucked inside Canada's top hat, is of limited use because oil prices are relatively low and unpredictable. The budget document includes a scary chart, and a version of which appeared in Mark Carney's Liberal leadership pamphlets almost a year ago, showing unprecedented uncertainty. Now that's based upon, again, not as good as the Bergen Optimism Index, but an index based upon like budget documents using the word uncertainty, which is like the worst kind of metadata trolling. I want to float this narrative back up, and maybe I'll go Ben first and then Jaxson here. Are we kind of whistling past the graveyard here with movement on files that we all are respectively interested in at a time in which, I know I'm middle-aged now because I can't get that deficit number out of my head. Like, can we just go back to that meta context of where the nation is and whether or not this budget is addressing the geopolitical moment? Ben, I'm putting a lot on your shoulders here, but I wanted to get that narrative in there.
Yeah.
Is it telling an accurate story about where Canada is at this moment to invest? Is probably the best way to ask.
So, if you pull us back 10 months ago and we saw the economic challenges with Trump, I made the comment in the position that Canada creates amazing invention, right? AI is something that we have the fathers of, with Hinton and with Yashia Bengio. Ozempic was actually created at the University of Toronto. We are a amazing country when it comes to invention. Where we have struggled is at the commercialization and invention side of things. And really what our organization at CCI has posited is that we don't have the public policy framework to capture the wealth that's being created. And so in a moment where we find ourselves no longer with easy access to a US market, where things are destabilizing, what do open small economies have to do to be successful? They have to be world leaders in certain sectors and fight like hell to make sure that they're global leaders and that people need those products. We can do that. Other countries have done it, whether it be Korea or the Nordics or others. And so for me, this really is actually a moment to realign, to say, where do we have capabilities? And then how do we build the institutions to capture that wealth? And so I think there's a tremendous amount of obviously risk in all of the moment that we're in, but there's also a tremendous amount of reward. We're 25% poorer than the Americans. And that has real consequences in terms of the quality of life that we can have, and ultimately the types of social programs that we can give to our citizens. And so our goal, our real national project, is how do we build a prosperity strategy that pulls us into the 21st century and has us not as supplicants, not as a branch plant economic model, but one where certain technologies that we have are so coveted that people don't fuck with us because they realize that they need access to them in order to improve the lives of their citizens. And we can do that. We've missed the boat on a couple of those technologies recently, but we mentioned quantum, we mentioned dual purpose defense technology. There are others where we have those types of capabilities. And so for me, there is a tremendous amount of risk, but the opportunity in front of us is great. And we have a history of being a nation that is able to come up with the ideas that end up being used to solve great problems. And I think we're in that moment again. The question now is, do we have a government that is willing to take these inputs, right, this investment that they're claiming that they're putting forward, and then figure out how to turn it into outputs? Analogy I'll give is the railroad, right? We built this $1 billion railroad that connected Vancouver all the way to Eastern Canada. The railroad didn't actually create the wealth. It was all the institutions that we put along it. It was the co-ops, the wheat board. It was the Ukrainian immigrants that we brought in that were able to actually farm the land. It was the grain elevators. And we're in that moment again, where we've got amazing talent, we've got amazing people, and now we've got to figure out how do you actually capture it. And this is where I think the budget has a big question mark for me, is how are you capturing the wealth? Great, we've agreed on the inputs. It's dual purpose defense, but how are you going to capture it? And that's where I think, an organization like the Council of Canadian Innovators is really primed and positioned to say to the government, here's where you can do these things.
Look, God, he is just on another level this year.
Good at his job. His job.
I know.
No, that's great.
It was perfectly executed.
He's
Sorry,
not.
Beth,
He's not.
It's 10 years, kids.
Wrong.
It's 10 years. It's 10 years.
I'm just saying he's not wrong. What really resonated, and Jaxson, you should interrupt me because I know it's your turn. But Ben saying people are FUCking with us is like, yeah, that's the reality. And like something else I appreciate about this moment, though it's been a long moment, is that we're getting so much more real talk from our prime minister and from our leadership, right? And you can say that the word uncertainty is maybe too soft for what we're in, but like we are under attack. There's a very large nation, and there are companies in that nation who want to achieve dominance over us, right? Who want to subordinate us and keep us subordinate. That is what we're up against. That is why I come back to being a little bit sort of surprised, or I'll say more intrigued around this like reality of the digital economy and how we experience it. The flip side of that coin is like maybe anything we say about capital B big tech is poking that bear that we're dealing with right now in a trade negotiation. And that could be a reason why this budget is perhaps intentionally a little quieter about that.
Yeah. Okay. Jaxson, I want you to have the opportunity to extend on that. If you have anything to add or just to reinforce, but I'm going to give you one additional question to maybe articulate this idea fully. And I'll go again back comparison last year to this year. Last year's reaction was a flip the table, set it on fire, shut this thing down, because the collective frustration and malaise relative to things aren't improving, we're not seeing progress, there are commitments that are not being executed on, had a little sprinkle on top of blame read by the audience that I speak to, that the capital gains tax exception was a punishment for them not doing their part. It seems like that has been replaced by a grim pragmatism of what Ben and Vass just spoke to, of realizing, well, we still have to do all the things we were frustrated about not happening before, but now we don't, it's not just we're upset at ourselves for not tidying our room. We have an existential threat to get our house in order. And the only way is through investment in building, because we don't have that opportunity anymore. Is that a fair read to the sentiment here when we're talking about? I would be hard pressed to see another government lay out this type of spending in this way and not have this reaction unless it was tied to both the political turnover and the moment. Is that fair?
Well, let's talk about like the specifics of what happened, right? There was a budget and a political environment that didn't land. Eventually, not that there was a direct through line here, but later that year, there was another budget presented. The finance minister ended up resigning. Shortly after the prime minister ended up resigning, we had an election. And now we have an entirely new kind of mandate, right?
I could give you a through line, Jaxson, if you want to do it. I actually wrote that through line, but...
You wrote the through line, Douglas. Here's what actually has been happening, right? Like the capital gains piece was reversed. It was taken up by all candidates. It's now like, seems to be enshrined as a general consensus, like, let's not mess with that. maybe in the far gone future, there is a new economic reality and we've built growth industries and we might be able to do some more equalizing, right? Maybe we built the sovereign wealth fund. Who knows? Bottom line is that there's been a dramatic change. Carbon tax, any of these divisive things that we're maybe taking away from what do we actually need to do to grow the economy. The Prime Minister and a lot of confident cabinet ministers have been dealing with these things, right? Immigration has been curtailed and is now on a much, much more sustainable path. They're reducing it dramatically. They're increasing the number of economic migrants. Like, these are all real, actual policy actions. And Vass spoke to the tone. I mean, Vass and I were at the same event, spoke with a very senior government minister, and his tone was very much, listen, we are being not just threatened, but yes, we are being attacked. Like, our industries are being actively drained. People are going after what makes us have a good place to live, right? Which is the money and the industries that power it. And so the government's trying to not just cover all the bases, but actually say, to Ben's point, like, let's pick a few areas we can win. Critical minerals, AI, right? I think what is left wanting for me a little bit is, if you think about AI, Ben mentioned that we've missed a few boats. AI, we invented the stuff basically in Canada, and Canadian researchers did. We have missed a lot of the innovation opportunities to capitalize on those, not just because we didn't patent the stuff, but because we didn't commercialize it, right? We didn't grow and build it in Canada. We're going to be able to yield a lot of benefits from adoption, right? Some of our big banks, the government, we're going to see a lot of productivity benefits if we do that well. We're seeing some positive moves. But I guess the next question is, okay, well, how do we not miss the boat again? Can we do that on quantum? Can we do that on space? And so for quantum, what we see here is the government putting about $330 million in. That's a decent amount of money, but if we look at the capital pools and the land grab happening in the space, that alone is not enough. And so my read on this currently for quantum is, okay, how do we at least keep our anchor companies like Xanadu and Photonic and Nord Quantique here in the country so they don't flee? This is a good pool of capital to help them do that. But I imagine there's more coming up that's actually going to say, okay, this is a dual use technology. It's useful for defense. We're seeing the government put like $1 billion into BDC focused on defense. I think another several $100 million into ISED focused on defense and dual use. And so
we're tracking over 80 billion in defense commitments just in this budget. It's bigger,
which is huge,
in terms of
huge
commitments across most of the things that BetaKit has covered in total. So I hear you.
So to circle back to that, that's a complete and total shift from a year ago. Complete and total shift, right? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. We're going to take a break, and then when we come back, we're going to work through some of the specifics, because we've got to get into the details of this, the questions that you have.
Yep.
We're going to stack rank these things, but I want to close this segment with just one final question. And this is dealer's choice, whoever wants it, 280 characters or less, because in the national media, the non-embedded, super informed, multi-year award-winning business tech media that is BetaKit, there's this ongoing narrative of like, well, there might be an election from this. Will this budget even pass? Who would like to raise their hand and put a stake through that idea right now? Would someone like to just kill that idea that that Carney is somehow angling for an election, or that any other party in this country is dumb enough to walk into that?
So I think yesterday's crossing on the floor put a nail in that coffer.
Okay. Well,
this thing's getting passed, and the other thing is that the Prime Minister, I think, has probably put in some conditions where some maneuvering can happen in order to get other parties on board. But at the end of the day, someone crossing the floor in a moment like this is also a big indicator that that there's momentum behind stability and continuity.
That we might be a serious country. Okay. So we're going to take a quick break.
Very quickly on this. Sorry. Budgets being debated and determined in our parliamentary democracy is a very serious thing, and it's legitimate and it's allowed. And even if this budget didn't pass, that is still democracy doing its thing. So I don't want us to negate that. We are a parliamentary democracy where budgets must be passed by a majority. And if we were to be forced into election, less than ideal, I would say. However, that is how our system works, and it is a beautiful thing.
I am in totally favor of our democratic institutions. I encourage all MPs to vote their conscience, not just by what their party whip says. Duly noted.
Great. Oh my goodness.
Great.
Okay. We're going to take a quick break. This is why I love you guys. We should do this. We should do this every week. We're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to get into the serious details of some of these budget commitments and considerations and the outstanding questions.
Zoholics Toronto 2025. Zoho's flagship user conference returns November 18th to 19th at the Toronto Congress Centre. Join hundreds of business leaders, customers, and Zoho experts for 2 days of learning, networking, and hands-on sessions designed to help your business work smarter. Discover the latest in AI, automation, and collaboration across Zoho's all-in-one suite of apps. Plus, hear directly from the people behind the products shaping the future of business software. Don't miss your chance to connect and grow with the Zoho community. Visit events.zoho.com/Zoholics 2025 to learn more and register today.
All right, we're back. And again, we promised our expert guest of panelists two things. They would get to bring some nugs and then indicate which dipping sauce they needed of greater detail. I've got a list here of specifics in the budget that BetaKit's been covering. We've already written some 4,000 words. By the time this goes out, that'll probably have increased commensurate with the deficit. It would be really boring if we just went through piece by piece. So I'm going to throw to each expert policy wonk, and then they're going to give you the nug, and then a little additional sauce that has to go with it. And I guess we're going to have to start here. I think, Jaxson, let's kick up what you were talking about first in the opening segment, because I think the AI and quantum stuff, addressing the positives and the negatives and what's missing there is really, really important. So you want to maybe start with restating some of that and then other things that you're seeing? Let's just go there and continue that conversation through, because I feel like I really cut you off on the top half.
No, it's all good, and feel free to cut me off again if I'm rambling. I get too excited, as you know. Okay, let's just try and rapid fire through. So AI, quantum, space. So AI, to be honest, if I was just to look at AI real quick and just look at the top line numbers, I wouldn't think that this was revolutionary. But again, what matters here is, their government's going to make a big investment in sovereign cloud, which I know lots of Canadian companies in particular in the public service, that's very important. Second is they're unlocking the Canadian infrastructure bank funding and the capacity for the minister to do MOUs. That's actually really cool because, when we talk about the electric vehicle expansion that was happening, obviously that's encountering some challenges due to massive geopolitical changes, especially with the US. But think about how quickly that happened for our country. That was intended to be extremely transformative. Some of those factories have already been set up. So rather than the government just saying, hey, let's go and spend $50 billion on data centers of public money, it's probably not a good use of money. Instead, what makes probably more sense is the minister has an involved capacity to go out and help bring together Canadian domestic partners and potentially international capital to go and make that happen, and in a way that is serving the public interest and expediting things on the energy setup side. That seems to make a lot of sense. And so I think there's just more to come there, and we'll probably see a much more detailed plan after the AI task force presents their plan and that comes out in a strategy.
Let me follow up with you on that, because I'm glad that you're taking this framing. Obviously, re-announcing $800 million worth of previously announced funding doesn't resonate, particularly how much this AI minister has been, road showing and barn burning the existential crisis that we face and the need to have this level of sovereignty. Alex Reel for BetaKit a couple weeks ago was tracking this MOU strategy, both with Cohere, which other Canadian tech companies had basically considered that had been anointed by the government, and we're looking for the same in the defense tech space. I want to ask you if you think that's the right approach for our AI minister to take, because the question that I've frankly had with this, and what I've been hearing from some people, is can the AI minister get anything done? Does the AI minister have any influence without a budget associated to that? If it doesn't have capital deploy similar to other, because he's not the minister of industry, he's the minister of AI, right? But what I'm hearing from you, I think, is through the MOUs and other mechanisms, this minister could maybe help catalyze some movement in a way that doesn't require the government taking out their checkbook and making those commitments. Is that right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, look, the minister is in a tough spot because he had to do three things really fast, right? One is completely reset the narrative on AI in Canada, which is he wants to grow the AI economy. He also wants to make sure it gets used in the public service. And at the same time, he also wants to make sure that Canadians have trust in it, which might involve, some changes in the regulatory side. On the regulatory side, he needs to get an actual consultation done, which the previous government, which again I was a part of, we didn't do to quite the same extent that is now being done. Right, we've now got a national consultation. It's been 10,000, public submissions, and similarly, he's appointed sort of a blue ribbon AI task force, or similar to the previous advisory council, which will facilitate lots of different inputs, and that's essential to kind of give you, number one, credibility in the eyes of the public, and two, policy cover, so you can say, look, this has all been informed by lots of expertise and data from lots of the public, right? So those are good things to kind of build trust and send the right signals. But then the last thing he has to do is not just, hey, here's a bunch of public money, let's go and build data centers. He actually has to tee up, hey, we've got the biggest AI company, one of the best in the world, signed up to actually deliver for the government. And we've got some good early test cases of that actually working. And second is, he's been going around the world. He's been going to the Gulf states. He's been going to a lot of international partners at big companies and teeing up like, hey, like I've got the capital ready. Once we get the task force stuff in, then let's go big because I've got all the components to pull together. He almost had to build the AI stack overnight to then match it with the capital to come. And then at the same time, he said, December, we're going to see new privacy rules come in. And then probably forthcoming, we'll see some targeted AI legislation. So that's my read on what his roadmap is.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's totally fair. Let's quickly switch then to the other thing that you brought up on the quantum side, because I'm struggling to understand, again, because our AI minister has been speaking about cloud, AI, and quantum often in the same breath as they are kind of connected. Again, pointing at Vass here, to our experience with the internet and our future experience with the internet. Make sense that the quantum commitments are coming through the defense industrial strategy that is yet to be announced, which is owned by a completely different branch of government. But then a lot of the earmarking for those commitments, and it was like about around 300 million, and there was like 100 million for research, and then 200 million for like making us win or whatever. Again, just little nuggets. You had mentioned before that the financial commitment to quantum was maybe not what was needed. Why is this sitting in the defense strategy beyond dual use components? Or maybe that's
so
it.
You talk about defense is like the biggest pool of money, right? 80 billion. We might even eventually somehow get up to, even up to 150 billion a year in defense investments, right? And when you think about quantum, I think everybody's always thinking about, okay, how do we have this computer that can do these amazing, incredible things? But it's not just quantum computing. A lot of quantum is actually about our security as a country. It's about our communication networks. It's about satellites, so it's inherently tied to space. And so having that be a dual use piece of the mechanism is essential. The reason why it's just, there's a bucket for ISED and the innovation side, but I think a lot of that future funding is likely going to come through the defense envelope. And it could inherently, again, be tied to, how can Canada be prepared for a post-quantum future? So wherein quantum computing could break existing encryption, could it actually prevent sensitive government resources? Could it help save our national security systems? And so when we think about what the government's trying to do, I imagine it's keep our current quantum leaders anchored in the country, set up some future opportunities for major defense setting, and at the same time, like give us on the space side some sovereign launch capabilities, which they're investing 100 million in, and then try and make sure basically in the future can we launch our own satellites that are prepared for a quantum future, and we actually own some key IP in that stack so that it's Canadian protected, and then we're also benefiting from the commercialization at the same time.
Gotcha. Okay. So instead of having the Department of Quantum, we're folding this into the things that we already need to do anyways, where it overlaps. Again, like some effective central banker type stuff. But we'll say on the commercial spaceport launch stuff, North Space CEO Rahul Goel is like literally over the moon about that announcement. You can read about that in BetaKit.
Moon.
That's incredible.
Yeah. Okay. So you helped us dig into the details and some of the questions, and honestly, like, answer your own questions a little bit off the top here. Anything else from you that we haven't addressed of your personal, like, let's throw that milkshake in here to the happy meal of things that you were either really happy to see or just you've got more questions about.
Yeah, I mean, I think basically I think the proof is going to be in the pudding for AI and quantum. Like, what's going to matter is over the next 6 to 9 months, like, do we see that it has all the components that we need to see at an urgency? And so I think the current signs are promising, and I'm hopeful that comes. I think, and this will lead in, and I don't want to take up too much room, but maybe naturally to things that Ben and Vass might speak on. But do we have the capital to make that happen? Do we actually protect the IP that we do generate out of that industrial policy? I think the one like lingering thing that is kind of in the back of my mind, and maybe it's too personal, and you know this, Douglas, but what is the vehicle for doing this on the innovation policy side in terms of capital, right? And so I saw this little hidden provision. It was like 750 million focused on early stage to scaling up companies. I am curious if this is going to be trying to revive this Dan Bresnitz's innovation agency that the government did a lot of work on and then shelved. And what that meant to do was consolidate IRAP and some other programs and just have a steady vehicle until you get to the point of, let's say, 20 million in capital raise, because that's where the discontinuity was happening for a lot of startups. And so that's a one like kind of medium-term lingering question for me is, do they consolidate the vehicles of innovation program delivery? And I know Vass and Ben will have lots of thoughts on that.
Jaxson, I'm smiling so much because not only did we include the concept of the Canada Innovation Corporation in our budget primer, I think we're the only people that remember that the previous Liberal government actually promised that thing was going to be coming back 26, 27-ish after the next election. Correct. Obviously, completely different Liberal government.
BetaKit's got a long memory for innovation
yes.
policy. Watch out.
Of promises that don't come through. Absolutely. Also, again, we've had Dan Bresnitz on the podcast. I would strongly recommend checking that episode out. Remembering that was also supposed to be not what it got scoped to be, but a Canadian answer to DARPA, which is another component to this. When you look at funding mechanisms, like apparently BDC is going to become a defense tech investor now, because they've been doing so great with all the other sectors. I think maybe I'll go to Ben first on this, because I know Vass and I, all we want to do is talk about our first love, is talk about competition. But the capital and some of the mechanisms, Ben, seem closer to what you were speaking to on the top. Do you want to pick up the torch and carry it, or add to it?
Yeah, so I think I'll add to it, because I think the big thing for us at the council is actually on really what is the definition of a sovereign company, or what it actually means to buy Canadian, right? So we see a tremendous amount of obviously support in terms of the language around buying Canadian, supporting Canadian, procuring Canadian. But at the end of the day, what is a Canadian firm? And that's where this budget doesn't really lend itself to help reveal what that means. And that will have huge implications for everything that's in the budget, whether it be the billions that are for defense, whether that be for how we're going to modernize our bureaucracy and how we're actually delivering services. And the things that I'll give to you here is really, currently as it stands, if you're incorporated in Canada, you're considered a Canadian corporation. So Huawei Canada is a Canadian company. Google Canada is a Canadian company. IBM Canada is a Canadian company. And so at the end of the day, if we end up just spending money in foreign multinational firms that are masquerading as Canadian companies, we're not actually using this moment to build Canadian capacity and to support domestic firms. And as I mentioned at the top of this podcast, this is an investment budget, meaning that you got to show how you're going to get returns from all of this spending. And you don't get it by buying products from another country. You get it from buying products from your own country that then can be sold to other countries and other jurisdictions. And so for me, the proof is in the pudding, to quote Jaxson, or the devil's in the details, is what is a Canadian company and what are you actually considering by Canadian? Because if everything ends up just flowing to AWS as it pertains to sovereign cloud and sovereign compute because they're using their Canadian subsidiary, you're not advancing the ecosystem and you're not advancing Canadian capacity and you're not strengthening our hand. And that, I think, is really the big nugget, or Big Mac, or whatever fun term you want to use, that I would say is critical. Because if you don't get that right, then all of the investment actually just becomes an expenditure, and it doesn't actually become a return on Canadian taxpayers' money.
Yeah, I would say it's a Whopper Junior. I think the only thing worse than a branch plan economy is like a branch investment bank. And I'll say, as the editor-in-chief of a multi-time award-winning news publication that is not considered a qualified journalism organization in this country because of some CRA tax code stuff that we really, really need to figure out a robust and effective definition. But Ben, tying it back to the budget, which components does that definition of sovereignty tie into? Like, obviously, like you talked about compute, so that's some of the AI stuff. I'm assuming it's really important when it comes to quantum, shred. Like, where are the touch points of that important point in the budget?
So, here's a really good example I'll give you of a previous budget where we didn't kind of see it come to fruition. So the government created something called the Strategic Innovation Fund, a number of years ago, right? Billions of dollars allocating towards what you think should be a strategic innovation fund. So things that are strategic for Canada. Turns out 60% of every dollar ended up going to a foreign multinational. Microsoft got $40 million in Vancouver, and it made it more difficult for fintechs to hire talent because they were being hoovered up by MasterCard, right? So, when you now look at the government has pivoted the Strategic Innovation Fund to now being the Strategic Defense Fund for the tariffs. If you're Canadian incorporated, you can access funding, meaning that companies that are Canadian in name only can access those types of dollars. And if you take a program like Shred, look, there were a lot of good things that CCI has been advocating for in Shred for the last 5 years. And we got, I would say, close to 80% of them. We've seen efficiencies in how the program is being done. We're seeing, Shred financing being tightened. We're seeing a lot of what I would call the administrative things being ultimate wins. But, what Canadians also need to be aware is that Huawei received $100 million in Shred funding up until 2023, meaning that we're subsidizing foreign multinationals that we view as our adversary in this space. And so if that kind of stuff can continue, that's an issue, right? It doesn't matter how efficient a program is. If percentages of it are going to support the building up of other countries, that's philanthropy. And that is not something that in a capital constraint universe, we can be doing anymore as a country. We've got to focus every dollar we can on turning it into 10 and making sure that Canadian companies not only get what they need to scale and grow, but be able to sell their products globally.
Yeah. Okay. Duly noted. Is there anything else? Because that's a really broad ranging consideration that tackles so many components of the budget, innovation policy, things like that. Is there anything more targeted, contained, isolated that you really were happy to see or disappointed to not see? Like we've been using this dumb fast food metaphor the whole thing. I don't know what this would be like. Where's the free toy that you were expecting that you didn't get, or something like that? Like something that's like isolated that you were looking for.
So I think the big thing is how are we using our IP and our data effectively, and how are we playing for the future? We kind of alluded to some of the challenges that we have in AI, where a lot of the core IP that was created out of things like the Vector Institute and the Pan-Canadian AI strategy ultimately ended up in the hands of foreign multinationals. How do we make sure we're not doing that for quantum? Whereas I mentioned before, we've got brilliant innovators. How do we make sure that IP is actually being cataloged and defended in order for Canadian firms to use it in the future? And so we saw, I would say some green lights with the extension of the funding of the IAC, the Innovation Asset Collective, but it could have gone further. The government could have really looked at how do we build institutions that capture wealth in data, in copyright and in IP going into new opportunities. And the government spends just federally $7 billion-ish on basic research and on the discovery of new technologies. And so if we want to capture and protect those types of investments, we have to have good stewardship. And so for us, things like an innovation asset bank really actually are kind of critical at a moment like this, where we're figuring out how to actually marshal our forces and say, look, we're planting seeds today because these will become trees years from now. And that is ultimately how we're going to get out of this. There's no silver bullets. It really is being strategic in terms of thinking about how are you spending dollars today and what will those mean into the future.
Okay. And it's also probably worth noting for the audience that we are recording this like the day after the budget, but also 2 days after quantum company Xanadu announced that they're looking to go public via a SPAC. And one of the questions that I have there, having had Christian on this podcast twice talking about the hundreds of millions of dollars he was looking to raise to fight to keep his company Canadian, whether he just had to go to the public markets to do that, if that was a better method. But then once you are responsible for your shareholders, whether or not we might see a Xanadu follow a similar path to D-Wave or other quantum companies historically, right? Like, again, it's the it's not a silver bullet, it's not an oversized check, but it's that kind of structural thing that leads to these changes and developments that are hard to take back afterwards. Okay, Vass, let's get into this. I know you got some big
Douglas,
questions. What is the internet? What is competition?
what is
What are
is the
your
internet?
nugs?
Look, okay, here's a few nugs to dunk. I was saying this budget sort of forgets about the internet and how we experience that our everyday lives kind of through our phones. That's a little bit wrong. There's some tiny things in here that I think are probably going to go underappreciated. One is, the previously announced we're going to do automatic tax filing for Canadians. This was under attack in the US when it was proposed, right? From corporate interests. That is Canada building digital public infrastructure, improving tax filing, and standing up to corporate power. That's really cool. There's some language around workers who are misclassified as independent contractors. That's a gig work provision, right? That's corporate power, monopsony power, platforms, people who are not kind of adequately recognized as workers. So, I think writ large in terms of how a budget can also shield people from the force of corporate power constraining them in their everyday lives and kind of reducing consumer choice. Those are important things to shout out. Happy to talk more about competition with you always, like anytime. I'll just say that you can't divorce a competition agenda from that cost of living agenda. And a lot of what we saw in the broader or see so far in the window around cost of living is sort of this promise like, well, we're not going to charge you these things, right? We'll see a tax reduction. That's great. But we haven't seen a more fulsome articulation of that role of the state in terms of, there's clues here, right? That Carney does see the role of the state to stimulate and catalyze new markets, right? Support the growth. We've heard about quantum. We've heard about the adoption of AI. We've seen the kind of looking over the horizon on the future of finance, recognizing the threat of the Genius Act with stablecoin. Wonderful. But I would just sort of put forward as somebody who often also has their eyes not just on what's great for Canadian businesses, but also what's great for Canadian consumers of those businesses. I'm very alive to that. In terms of like a milkshake, and I don't remember if like the milkshake was like good or bad or delicious in our analogy. Okay. We were talking about Danny Bresnitz earlier. Dan's, excellent work. When Dan went into the government for the period of a year, he went into the government through something called the interchange program, right? And historically, interchange has facilitated a particular kind of expert who tends to be an economist or economist adjacent. We've seen Armin Yalzinian go into the government through that program. We've seen Mike Moffat go into the government through that program. And, these people go in, they do a tour of duty, they do their best and, to provide advice, to provide research, to kind of stimulate elements. We're seeing something really interesting in this budget that could be really promising. It could also be problematic, that we're going to bring in about 50 experts from the private sector, right? Very particular kind of expert into the government. Great. For what? For how long, right? We've seen some success with ad hoc, government consultation, inputs, the ability. You could probably argue that maybe historically Canada has been listening more to the oligopolists and foreign business interests than it has, to the broader Canadian independent business and startup community, right? I don't want to pit tech against other businesses and other forms of entrepreneurialism. But that's an interesting conversation because it's really signaling that this government wants more of a very particular kind of expertise. And what else could we do to make sure that we're getting kind of more ongoing, deep, and independent expertise for our government? We kind of dismantled a few kind of institutions in the 90s. I've been going back to a lot of readings from the 90s recently. Don't want to get into it. No, I'm just kidding. But, again, who is the government listening to, when, and why? And just back to books for a second. I know everyone, big readers. the Coots Diaries, right, from Trudeau's principal secretary, recently came out in an edited volume. And honestly, in a way, that's a story of the history of corporate influence over public policy in Canada, right? So it's not that businesses seeking to influence policy is new. It's also not that businesses seeking to influence policy is bad. But what is the government hoping that technologists can do within government that they cannot do outside of in a more maybe transparent way? That's, I think, something to watch for Canada.
Who watches the builders, Vass? That's the question. Jaxson, you got something to add to that, man?
Yeah, I mean, I had this one noted down as well, so I'm super glad that Vass brought it up. That Interchange Canada program, I think they're going to rename it the Build Canada Exchange Program. I don't know if that's a call out to our friends at Build Canada, but I think very cool that they may have suggested it. Either way, I think this is one of the programs that, if executed correctly, could have more impact on the government than many other measures. One of the reasons I can think of is because, Douglas, and I think you know that I just did a recent tour of duty in the government, originally coming from the tech sector. And my experience was, one, that it was a massive learning opportunity for me, but two was even just coming with some experience in startups was a massive add to the policy and program design that we were able to do. And so I think that Canada compared to the US, one of the things that we struggle with is this like false purity test where like, now that I've left the government, it's actually very hard for me to continue to interface with colleagues. You're banned from lobbying. In fact, I couldn't go and, necessarily work alongside Ben directly in the same capacity. And some of that is good, right? Like we should, not having a revolving door and people changing size and just this, but it does disincentivize closer interaction, right? Whereas in the US, I mean, if you look at, how did they design the CHIPS Act, this $50 billion semiconductor investment program? I mean, they brought in the top expert on semiconductors for 2 years into government to go and design it. And now they've built one of the most advanced facilities in the world. So long story short, like I think if it's well done, it could be really, really useful. And it might just make it easier for people to do those tours of duty over time. I'm hopeful that it might get replicated on the other side, and then more people in the public sector be wanting to actually go and do tours of duty in the private sector. And that there is this natural kind of interaction, facilitation back and forth. And I think it would make our economy much more vibrant and competitive, because otherwise people get stuck in their own ways of knowing. And I think that's kind of the reason why we are here today, whether, we think about the competition frameworks we've had for 40 years or the financial tech regulation as well in particular, right? Not enough interaction.
Yeah. Oh, I would have loved to see more leaders from Canada's tech sector be active in the public and transparent many mechanisms we had when reviewing Canada's Competition Act and also defending it. So I know that element of the revolving door and sort of can inhibit people when they leave. And you're right that we need a more permeable government that, allows people to circulate across public and private sectors for sure. I just don't know. It's not clear to me what's preventing that kind of input of expertise to government right now, or what the government hopes to achieve from it beyond, hey, let's solve this problem of we want to build this particular digital public infrastructure, or we want strategic ongoing advice on the future of money. Again, that's why I sort of just say devil's in the details, but it's something new and different that Canada's doing, which is great.
Yeah. And it's so important because it's part of the reason why we have people like you on this podcast for our audience is to, and we've used Ben for this so much, but I think each of you in your own way, peel back the curtain on those dynamics and those relationships because it is so obfuscated. And, as someone who's been covering this Canadian startup space for over a decade now, seeing the ecosystem learn and try to navigate how to engage with different governments over time and what was required has been really interesting. I will say if the Build Canada Exchange is what brings Jaxson back into government service, we are doing another emergency podcast. We'll cover that live. But Vass, following up on some of the other things that you said and kind of adding mine into the mix, because you guys have covered most of this. The one thing I haven't really talked about yet was this probably the weightiest components of the budget, separate from the defense stuff, was what's going on with financial services innovation, and I say broadly competition. Vass, I think you were alluding to before when it comes to some of the privacy considerations, some of the policy stuff. For AI, we're waiting for future laws to come. We did actually see one commitment in the budget to change the PIPEDA, which is related to, hey, open banking. We're going to do it. It seems like the new finance minister found the keys to the drawer of the old finance minister's desk, opened it up, and then there was all of these reports and commitments just sitting in there that they're going to move through. So we're getting the second phase of open banking. It's actually going to move forward. And there were timelines and commitments for not only just this framework to allow businesses to share information, but we're going to get write access as well, which is why PIPEDA requires some updating, because there's privacy considerations with that. We are also getting a commitment for language as it relates to stable coins, mostly on the issuance. And then there's some really interesting stuff. I really recommend everyone reads Madison McLaughlin's piece on this, talking about when it comes to regulation of these things as securities or currency, the government, it seems to be taking either what is the laziest or the smartest approach here. Most because Canadian. So much of what we're talking about is, there's all of these earmarked commitments, but the devil is in the execution. They're basically saying whether or not the stablecoin is a security or a currency is going to really depend upon how it's used. And I think it's just crazy enough to work, but we're definitely going to cover it. The reason why I care so much about this stuff isn't that I'm some sort of fintech bro. It's still trying to wrap my head around stablecoins as an end run around our current monetary system and whether or not that's a good thing. The reason why I am so happy to see this, and while we haven't, while there is a play coming out next month where Matt Boswell, our competition commissioner, features heavily as the hero, the tragic hero of the story, we have not done enough to, from a policy standpoint, rework competition. But we are starting to see some loosening that will allow financial service innovators, fintech companies, to compete at least on the same goddamn playing field. It's something that we've been waiting for almost a decade now. It seemed too straightforward and easy to not do, and yet we've run up against these roadblocks again and again. We have seen the responsibility of this being handed over to the Bank of Canada, which I take, this is Douglas's perspective, as an indictment.
It's your show.
Of the previous administrators of this process. And I'll closely look at all of your facial reactions to see whether or not you agree or disagree. But I see this as like we didn't even get into like the commitments to remove like transfer fees. And it's like Vass, you've been a big junk fee person. We're starting to see
junky.
Some tightening and some loosening here that actually allows financial services companies that just want a non-asinine approach to banking services for Canadians have some space to play. Does that not just grow your heart 3 sizes?
It's going to burst out of this sweater. Look, to the extent that this new government, when they do have their ear to the ground to the business community, is able to also listen not just to incumbents, right, but to challengers, right? And what challengers need: interoperability, data portability, the data portability that open banking promises and that we're finally going to see is hugely empowering for consumers, also for other businesses, arguably also for large technology companies that are data hungry and want access, want to incentivize access to our financial information. But you're right, it's a big deal. Don't forget, one of the last things that outgoing Prime Minister Justin Trudeau did was an order in council that capped NSF fees. That was a shot at the banks, right? That was never going to happen unless there was government intervening and moderating that market. So I'm glad you're shouting it out. I think it helps us get closer to what is the ideology for Canadian tech, right? We've never really explicitly taken the time to articulate one. I think for a while we were just kind of blindly following this superstar firm model, right? And I think we're getting somewhere else now, which is more about a plurality, more about intentionally supporting certain sectors, right? And wanting to facilitate that freedom for citizens, freedom for consumers, and get more choice. So yeah, it's cool that Prime Minister Carney is looking at telecom and looking at banking and wanting to support, more competition in these federally regulated industries. I love the interprovincial work he's doing, working across the federation quickly, and more competition and breaking open markets, more markets in Canada to make them more free and fair is going to help grow our economy too. It's going to signal to people that you should invest here because your company has a shot, at growing and competing, and that our markets are healthy.
Yeah. Now the caveat to all of that was that like it's still dependent upon real-time rail rollout. There was so much like, and this is entirely dependent upon that becoming rolled out and then widely adopted by 2027, which is, my God, something that people are looking at being delayed for so long that it might no longer be viable. Those crazy crypto kids with their X402 protocols just might allow AI agents to spend digital money on the internet without any of us. All of this stuff might break, but again, it points to like Vass. We're getting to the close of this conversation. You're kind of going to these big questions of like, hey, maybe we should actually have a considered, thoughtful approach to how we treat these sectors and choose what's important and have some consistency across the board for how we approach it. Are there any other we started with narrative of the budget. Are there any takeaways, things that you're specifically looking for, or things that you'll be thinking about deeply going through this process as we look for this budget to become enacted in law? Like give us your take on the point to the future, and then we'll go around to the rest of our panel guests and do the same.
Okay, that's such a hard question and a big question because I'm always going to be watching tons of things very deeply from a policy perspective, right? Going back to the elements that we've already spoken about. But again, I'd say my eye is on how we're articulating the role of the state to stimulate, support, and capture value from markets, right? All markets have rules, right? All markets have rules. The difference is whether they're democratically set by us and we know what the rules are and we govern markets that way, or if we sit back and let private actors, usually the incumbents, usually the biggest companies, usually not Canadian, set the rules for those markets in their own favor and exploit Canadian companies and exploit Canadian consumers. So what I'm going to be looking at are things like the engine of the online economy, our broken ad tech stack, and other elements we can do as we try to build better digital public infrastructure, which is that sovereign cloud, sovereign compute conversation that Canada's having, which is a really important one for us to have. Very last thing I'll say is on Halloween, there was kind of a bit of a spooky update to the kind of digital sovereignty broader framework for Canada. And one of the elements there just sort of said, well, even though under US, various US legislation, the US can, access Canadian data and compel it. We don't have evidence that that's happened. So the whole thing about risk isn't whether or not it has happened, it's that it can, right? And the reality is that it can, and whether or not we can prove that it's already happened should not be what we're basing future decisions on. So I didn't actually, usually I like to end on something like fun, funny, cute, like flattering to me. No. And I didn't, but I'll say I'm going to be keeping my eye on that. Not this time. Yeah. Better luck next time, Gadget.
Okay, Jaxson, I'm going to go to you next because you have actually had a hand in constructing information, playing a role in a department that is part of a budget. And then you've seen what's happened next following from that. So I'm wondering, as you're looking forward, are there tactical things that we should be looking at in the process of the budget becoming law, evaluating the specific outcomes and whether those questions are being answered or ignored? Walk us through from your experience perspective, things that we should be keeping an eye on going forward to see how this is progressing.
Yeah, I mean, listen, high level, I agree with a lot of what Vass said. Fundamentally, as a country, you need an integrated strategy where the right arm is connected to the torso and then the left arm, right? And so on digital policy in the past, as an example, we've seen a lot of different things. We've seen the government, go far in one sense on the AI regulation and policy and the online safety side, but then was that connected to our competition policy? Was that connected to how we were thinking about financial markets? Was that how we were thinking about our IP strategy, right? And commercialization programs? there arguably could have been a lack of coherence in the past. And I think that's, what Ben has been doing for the last 10 years is trying to argue we need a coherent strategy that develops wealth in this country and protects our sovereignty. And Vass has also correctly identified that if we're not creating the right market conditions for our companies, our own companies, not just international ones, to come to Canada and prosper, then we haven't done the right thing, right? So do I think the government is broadly addressing and integrating a coherent strategy across a number of areas at the same time? Yes. That's a really, really hard job. And so they need our help, right? Like, I don't think, for example, the ministers said, look, we need sovereign AI, digital sovereignty, not solitude. He's gone to the task force. He's gone out for a lot of consultations. He doesn't know how to make that happen alone, right? And so what the tech community has to do is continue to stay engaged. It's not just a one and done budget boom, let's get all the money moving. It is, let's check in at multiple stages and milestones to say, is this actually meeting the expectations? If it's just a big waterfall type approach versus an agile one, we won't necessarily get what we want. And so this is a process, right? And we're not going to turn the entire ship around on one dime. I would say things I'm looking forward to tactically are, number one, again, more details on what's going to come post AI task force. Second is on quantum, specifically for the defense funding envelope. If we don't get enough quantum companies, enough money, to put it very clearly, we're going to lose some of our quantum companies. We're going to lose the IP that they've spent the last decade generating. So I'm concerned about that. And then on the space side, if we don't make, on top of this launch capability investment, we're not investing big in, everything that comes after that, both on the industrial and the defense side. Again, like, we just may not capitalize or own an essential part of the stack and the associated intellectual property and physical components that are part of that. One thing that was under kind of discussed or thought about, the whole world is contingent on chips. We've seen that slow down the U.S. automotive sector. We've also seen it, paralyze the economy. It's the biggest point of geopolitical conflict, but the budget does very little to talk about it. I think there's one line about spinning off our, government-owned photonics fabrication center. Probably a good thing. But what are we going to do on chips? And this is like a big thing that's part of every essential part of the stack. It's an essential part of AI and quantum. And again, if we can own the IP there, if we can own the actual physical factories and components, it's very hard to replicate these things. So what are we going to do on chips? That's kind of a big question mark that remains in my mind. But overall, I think it's a great start. I think if we all row in a positive direction and actually feed into this process in an ongoing way, we'll be in a good place.
Okay, Ben, we're going to close with you because the big win of Budget 2025 is that we got you back to cautiously optimistic, right? So I want to hear, and you can pick up on any of your policy wonk partners here, what you're going to be paying attention to. And then pointedly, if definition of sovereignty isn't delivered, are you going to draft one?
Yeah, so, I mean, as folks may know, I'm actually not really much of a listener. I'm more of a doer. And so in the next 6 months, what am I going to do with this budget is really, kind of what I'm going to put forward to listeners. And so, look, we've seen the government articulate that this is an investment budget. They are investing in our future. And the question mark is, what are the outputs going to be? How are we going to turn that $1 investment into 10? And the two pieces where I would say all of sort of the energy of the council is going to be really focused on is really around the definition of what it means to be sovereign and needs to be Canadian, because that will determine where procurement dollars are going to go. That's going to determine which firms get contracts and which don't, which are purchase orders, which are at the end of the day is what you do investments for, is the return. So that's definitely one big component of it in terms of the way that we're going to look at it. The second piece is really around how are we protecting the investments that we're making in research and development. And so if we're spending, as I mentioned, $7 billion a year specifically focused on basic R&D, are we actually capturing the IP that's being generated from it? So if we don't have things like an innovation asset bank as a collective to actually capture that, we are in essence giving subsidy and philanthropy to other countries and to other companies that are not Canadian owned. And so the moment that we're in is we have a government that has made big commitments on potential investments if done correctly. If not, it's just expenditures and it's pulling down our capacity and capabilities into the future. So that's where we'll really be focusing our energy over this next 6 months to work with officials, to work with government to help them understand it. Zeno's adorable, by the way.
Absolutely adorable addition to the podcast. It's a dramatic close and finish. I think what I'm taking away from all of you guys here is that it's you all three of you said some different version of we need to complete the stack. There's more to build here. So, if a budget is a story, it's not over, and we'll continue to track it. I really appreciate you guys digging in on this. We got the nugs, we got the sauce, we got some milkshakes. It was a delicious emergency budget podcast. I look forward to having each of you back on again. I guess, I was going to say for the fall economic statement, but that's now. Is there going to be a spring economic statement? What world do we live in? What's going on? I don't even know. We'll see you on the next episode.